Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, YRB Laws, and this is your co-host.
For Wells.
We appreciate the support on our most recent episode. It's performing very strong. Once again, shout out to KJ McDaniels for coming onto the show and giving some insight into the NBA world, his story journey, and his road to the NBA. So be sure to follow him on socials and continue to support us by liking and subscribing and following us on Instagram and X at the OBT Podcast. So we've officially finished the Southwest Division. That's what we wrapped up last episode. So now we have one left in the West, and that is the Northwest Division. Our first team in this division is the Minnesota Timberwolves. They're in the chopping block right now for us. And this is an interesting team. I think, the consensus is they definitely underperformed considering the move that they did make to acquire Rudy Gobert and some other moves that they also made as well. But I think their future is definitely bright, but we do have to talk about what happened in their offseason and in the previous season as well. Starting with their season, they did finish with a 42-40 record. I think that's kind of mediocre. I think we were expecting them to be a little bit better. I think people honestly thought they were going to be bad because of the Rudy Gobert trade. I think that's what the real consensus was. But nonetheless, that was still a horrible record, I think, for that squad that they have assembled.
I think there were some people who thought that they would be better, though, because there were
Sure.
some people who kind of zagged and thought that the two big man lineup would actually make them maybe
Right.
better. But, that ended up not happening. In fairness,
Yeah.
they had a couple of stretches where they looked good, and then I think Towns had that long stretch where he was out. But
Yes.
they just, to me, they never really impressed me. But I think, in fairness, there were some people that were high on it, but a lot of people thought that trade was awful.
Yeah. So their season kind of blew up in their own faces. But they did finish as the eighth seed. They scurried through the play-in, but then they faced Denver. I think that was a team that just was too much of a, just too much. The matchups, they just weren't working. Gobert pretty much got exposed. Although Edwards, I think, this is his time to take the leap for sure. But it's just a hard task to fight against Denver. So that's kind of how their season went. And then, if we look at their roster, I think it's a decent roster. Kind of some interesting people on here, but I think they did get better in general. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But just to give you guys their roster currently constructed, Rudy Gobert, Karl Anthony Towns, Mike Conley, Anthony Edwards, Naz Reid, Kyle Anderson, Shake Milton, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Troy Brown Jr., Jaden McDaniels, Wendell Moore Jr., Jordan McCollum, Leonard Miller, and Josh Mino. So overall, I think this is an interesting roster. They've got some solid playmakers. They definitely have two stars. That's something that I think they need to keep and continue to build around. Maybe not so much Towns, but definitely Anthony Edwards. Anthony Edwards is definitely a star. He's been hooping in the FIBA World Cup. He's been putting up really good numbers, and he's showing, putting the league on notice. So overall, I do like this roster. Like I said, I think the only glaring issue I think is really the Gobert thing, but they can't really escape that as of right now. So they're kind of stuck with this too big lineup. They do have an interesting roster here. Now they have three centers, and we'll talk about that. So they're keeping three centers on the roster. And then, kind of talk about the guys that don't get too much attention. I think Kyle Anderson is a good guy to keep around for sure. He does provide some things other than scoring and things like that. He's left open a fair amount, and he does hit his shots. It's just a slow jump shot, slow game style. And then Shake Milton, I think, is a great addition. He's a good playmaker, great scorer as well. A little 50-50 sometimes, could be a little shaky, but no pun intended, but he is a really good player to have around. And then Alexander Walker, they re-signed him. I think that's a great move as well. Young guy, definitely has some upside. Troy Brown Jr., I'm not too high on this one. This is maybe Wizards bias. He didn't really do too much for the Wizards. And you can even speak to it as well, as a Laker fan. I just don't think he provides too much. I don't think the jump shot is there consistently. It seems like, they say he can shoot, but from what I've seen, it's just, I don't know. It's can be abysmal at times, but they do have this stud, Jaden McDaniels. I'm really high on him as well. Wendell Moore Jr., great player as well. And then, they drafted Leonard Miller. So overall, I think this is a solid roster, although I'm not sure how it's going to look, when it comes time to, get into the playoffs. I'm just not sure how far this roster can go. But I think a lot of this is depending on Anthony Edwards to take a huge leap, considering that they did literally just pay him a decent chunk of money. So now to kind of get into their, I guess, what they've done in this offseason. So they did sign Naz Reid to a great contract extension. This is something that I think, was necessary for them to do. I think this was somebody that They should keep around for sure. Um, and then they re-signed Luke Garza to a two-way contract. I mean, that kind of is what it is. Um, then obviously drafted Leonard Miller. And then they also signed Shake Milton and Troy Brown, and then they gave Anthony Edwards a multi-year contract extension. And then, yeah, their final move, which was on July 10th, they re-signed Nickeil Alexander-Walker. So overall, I do like what they've done here. Nothing too crazy, but I think they have made solid moves. I think this is another case where it's more so quality over quantity. But I'm excited for their future, especially Anthony Edwards. But in general, what have your thoughts been on this squad? Because I think this is a very polarizing team at times, considering what they've given up to get Gobert.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the issue, when we look at this trade. Because that's kind of, when people look at it, they're always kind of gonna define it as, well, is this move gonna win you a championship? And I
Right.
think sometimes that can be kind of an unfair metric, I think, to kind of judge something. Because it doesn't always have to be, can you win a championship? Sometimes it's like, can you have a chance at winning a championship,
Sure.
right? Because like, even guys in the past, right? Like, say Aaron Gordon got a ton of money, a couple seasons ago, and people were like, that's a wild contract. But then, you watch him, and then he ended up, being a big part of a championship team, right? And nobody's really going to be saying like, oh, well, they shouldn't have given him that deal.
Right.
Even with the Donovan Mitchell thing, right? When he went to Cleveland, like, at the time people were saying like, they gave up, some things. But sometimes it's just about getting you closer to give you a shot. At the
Yes.
same time, though, I wouldn't necessarily say that for Minnesota because I never really looked at that team as like, oh, they're, this X piece away from being a title. They had that season, a couple years ago, right, when they were in the play in against the Clippers, right? I think, and then they went in against Memphis, right? And they had, a competitive series, but it was a series that I think people at times were kind of disappointed by because it felt like Minnesota had a lot of, advantages in that series and then
Absolutely.
would like, let some of those leads go away. And then they made the Gobert trade, right? And we can just go over it again, right? It was 4 firsts, one pick swap, right? Walker Kessler, and then in terms of the players, Malik Beasley, Pat Bev, Vanderbilt, Leandro Bolmaro, who I don't think is in the league right now.
Right.
All right, so all that for Rudy Gobert. Now for the players, right? Pat Bev, Vanderbilt, Beasley, Bolmaro, all those guys are gone from Utah, right?
Right.
So it was really more so about the picks and then Walker Kessler. So I mean that's pretty rough. I mean for the picks, I mean Minnesota's probably just going to be a middling team, record wise for the most part. So it's
Sure.
not like you're giving up like top 5 picks to Utah every year. So it may not look quite as bad, but I still think it's bad just because again I never felt like they were a Rudy Gobert away from that deal because it's one thing if you gave up those guys for some other player, right? Like you know whomever, name whomever you want, right?
Right.
Like maybe an upgrade at the guard spot, the point guard position, right? Because at that time they had D'Angelo Russell,
Sure.
right? So if you had gotten an upgrade from him, right, and you had used those pieces to get some other really good point guard, that's one thing. But to get it for Rudy Gobert, it just never made sense because I think
Considering the amount of money he's making as well.
yeah, and I think the thought process at the time was for Towns, it's like, well, he's not a great defensive big,
Hmm.
so let's get another really good defensive big around him. But he's not versatile enough, I think, to guard like fours and
And
like
Towns played four in college, but like you said, he was
yeah,
never a defender.
yeah, he's just the five. So it just doesn't really help because again, he's not versatile enough defensively, right? He's not like an AD or Giannis. I mean, like there's not too many guys like those, but
No.
he's not that type of guy where you can have him guard like multiple types of
Sure.
players at different positions. He
I
just
get you.
can't do that. So but at this point, you kind of have to deal with it. So you kind of just have to work around it and find ways to make it work. And I do think, some of the guys that they got should help, right? You got some guys who can shoot like a Shake Milton. You brought back Nas Reed, right? So that makes a lot of sense. Especially on a solid contract, right? You
Yes.
got Kyle Anderson as a vet. I know he and Gobert got into it last year, but still,
Right.
um, but then after and then Troy Brown Jr., I think in the regular season he was fine for the Lakers. Obviously in the playoffs he didn't really help out as much. But for a team like Minnesota, you're just trying to get wins like any way you can. So
Right.
they didn't. It would have been nice to have had a guy like that because then maybe instead of 42 and 40, maybe you're like 45, and like 30, uh,
Maybe. I don't
9
have
or what.
faith in the guy. I just have
Yeah,
to disagree
no, I
with you.
know.
But I understand. I
Yeah,
understand.
I'm just saying, like, I'm not saying he's going to win you a ton of games. I just meant it from, like, the perspective of the drop off was really in the playoffs because he had
Yes.
a decent amount of regular season games where he helped.
I agree.
especially when LeBron was out. But again, he's not a guy that's going to swing like, 20 whatever games for you, right? That mainly
No,
is more so comes down to the stars. And like you said, I think you're also banking on Edwards taking another jump, right? Because like you said, he's been great in the Olympics, right? Basically been the leader of that team. And again, he's also grown, I think, defensively as well, right? And given how athletic he is and his like, size, because he's a big dude,
it's
right? He's
only
not
right.
yeah, he's not super tall, but he's, big for his position.
Yes.
Um, with the long arms and the athleticism, he should be a good defender. So that will help, right? And then you have McDaniels, who's really good defensively, and Gobert can protect the rim, fine. So, I mean, ideally, you should have a decent amount of options defensively. So that should help, right? Anderson, Reed, those are good defenders. Troy Brown Jr. is okay defensively. Conley's at this point is not the same defensively. But he is like, a good locker room veteran guy, right? I think that trade was fine for Minnesota, right? Where they swapped Conley for D'Angelo Russell. And it's not like
Absolutely.
they had to give up, like anything of real value to, change that, right? So
Right.
I mean, that's fine. Although I do think, because of his age, you might be a little concerned about, is there a decline? Right? His game was never based off of athleticism. So, it's not like, the decline is going to be the same as for other guys, but his impact as an overall player, you do kind of wonder, at this point, right? He's going to like what 35 or 6 or whatever.
Right.
So, I mean,
I think
he's
he's a
starting
good guard to have around, Anthony Edwards though for
yeah,
sure. I think that's the right kind of
right.
person that you want.
Yeah, cuz we talked about it when they made the deal where it's like, yeah, you got a responsible adult in the room, that can help you out, and just overall kind of improve like the locker room and just the overall chemistry of the team. Cuz
Yes.
it felt like at times the chemistry wasn't great. Although in fairness, it wasn't like it was great by the end, right? Cuz you had the Gobert Kyle Anderson blow up. But, it seemed like they got over it. We'll see.
Right.
Um but either way, right, you look at their issues, right? We know what they were, right? They were fine offensively. They were 13th on offense, right? Which, could be better. But in fairness, a lot of that was with Towns out. Fourth in blocks, that makes sense, right? Because you got Gobert. Fifth in steals, right? Eighth in assists, right? So that's all fine.
Hmm.
Um, in terms of rebounds, 23rd, which is kind of surprising, right? Considering like that's a big team. You would think they'd be better, rebounding wise.
Yeah.
Um, but sometimes I guess it just doesn't work out like that. 3-point shooting, they were um 13th, right? So that's above average, right? And I guess that makes sense, right? Because again, you got Towns who's a good 3-point shooter, Conley's a good 3-point shooter. You would like for Edwards and McDaniels to get better, right? So if they do, right, then you should be a little better than last year. Then there's other stuff, right, that you might look at. And transition defense, I think at times is a problem. And that's just kind of, just an issue when you have two bigs, right? Especially because again, those two guys are centers, right? It's not like one of them's a center and then the other's, a center that's like, playing the four. Or it's no, that's the wrong way to describe it. I mean, like, it's not like one of them's a four,
Right.
but he's playing the five. They're both centers.
Right.
So because of that, you're going to get run out of off the floor at times, right? Like that's what happens sometimes against Denver, right? Where Denver, whenever Minnesota would miss, they just get out and run. Um, and it's kind of interesting because Bruce Brown on his podcast, or he was on a podcast, and he mentioned, I believe it was him, and I think he mentioned that he thought that the Timberwolves were the toughest opponent that they faced during the playoffs. And I do kind of wonder, like, what do you think about it? Because it's like, when you look at that, playoff matchups, right? Like they beat the Timberwolves in five,
Hmm.
they beat the Suns in six,
Hmm.
then they swept the Lakers, and then they beat the Heat in five.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I never really thought about that the Timberwolves were the toughest opponent. I thought it was more so like either Phoenix or or LA. Like one, I know LA got swept, but like I do think it was like a a but I also think like with Phoenix, right? They took 6 games, although the 2 games that Phoenix won, it was because Booker was insane.
yeah.
So maybe you also factor that in as well, and maybe you just look at Minnesota because they were a weird team, and sometimes like weird teams, it's kind of tough to figure out because they're so they're constructed very differently from a lot of other teams, right? You don't see as
Sure.
many teams now with 2 7-footers in the starting lineup, right?
Right.
And like even with Milwaukee, I guess you have 2 7-footers, but Giannis is not a typical 7-footer because he's so athletic, compared to guys that size. But I wonder what you think about that. Like, do you feel
Well,
like that's the case? Because I know you kind of, I think you picked Minnesota in
Yeah.
to beat or upset Denver in the playoffs.
Yeah.
So I guess you must have felt like they must have been a
Well,
little bit tougher than the record suggested.
yeah. So like my thing is with Minnesota, I feel like they're an anomaly in the league. It's weird because
Right.
and especially against Denver, I think they did have something that other teams didn't have, and that was that Gobert presence. I think they were probably scared of that, and they didn't necessarily know how to game plan for two centers. And Anthony Edwards as well. I don't think Anthony Edwards played, phenomenally. I think he had a couple of stinkers if my
Pretty good.
mind, yeah, he had good games, and then he had, I think, maybe one or two bad ones. But nonetheless, I think, with Phoenix, I think that's a team where you can game plan for very easily. They weren't deep, so, it was more so like, we're just gonna let them burn themselves out. And then, Booker did his thing. And then with the Lakers, I think that was another team where they could game plan for. But with Minnesota, I think it was just tough because probably they didn't really know what to necessarily do, with Gobert and Towns on the floor at the same time. But I don't know. That's kind of the way that I think about
That's
it.
kind of what I was thinking. But then
Yeah.
you also factor in, in fairness to Minnesota, they were missing McDaniels, right? Because he had broken his
Yes.
hand in that last regular season game. Um, and then Nas Reed, I think, was out as well. So, I mean, I don't know if that really changes it. Maybe if they were fully healthy, maybe it pushes it to 6.
Right.
So that's kind of the other factor, right? Because Minnesota had long stretches where Towns was out, so we didn't really see a lot of games where their team was whole. And
Sure.
then Mike Conley was a trade deadline addition. So we didn't see a whole lot of that as well. In the playoffs, right? He averaged 32, 5 and 5, 48 from the field, and then 35 from 3. So that's that's pretty good.
Yeah.
But I think like his best performances were towards the end of the series. I mean, I guess 5 games is a short series, but still. So he had some pretty good games because I remember Towns really struggled in a couple of those games, and then he
Yeah.
picked it up as the series went along. Um,
Maybe I was thinking about the play, and I think Anthony
yeah,
Edwards
he was
didn't play
bad
too well
against
in the
the
play
Lakers.
line. I
He
think
was
that's
bad
what it
against
was.
yeah, he was
You're
bad
right.
against
Yeah.
the Lakers in the play-in. I think he was much better against Denver, and sometimes it's the personnel, as well, right? Because like I guess with LA, right? Who did they have? They had like Vanderbilt, or sometimes I guess Schroeder, or
Sure.
like just ED in the paint, to kind of like make it tough for Edwards, right? Because they kind of made him more of a jump shooter, and
Right.
then and his jump shot, if it's not falling right, then obviously that makes it a lot tougher. Even though again he's a big physical athlete, for the position he plays, but that's kind of I think how we have to look at it, right? It's twofold, right? Because one, how much progression do we get from Edwards? Because that goes, kind of a long way into determining their ceiling. And I think
Hmm.
we've talked about that with a number of other teams, and there's other teams that we'll be talking about as well, right? Right, where like a lot of it is does Edwards progress, into like borderline superstar, territory?
Potentially, yeah. He's
Yeah,
close.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Like, does he get encroach that top 20 spot, right? Because I don't necessarily think he's like most people consider him a top 20 player yet.
I
But if
think
he's like
some do, but he's
yeah,
close.
some do, but if he's like universally regarded in that stretch, right, that goes a long way. How do the other guys look, right? Are they more comfortable? Are they healthy, right? Do they have better, luck in terms of the health? But then at the same time, does that amount to them going much further in the playoffs? And I think that's kind of where, we have some questions about that, right? Because again, they went out in the first round last season, but, again, this season, right? I don't really expect it to be much different. I mean, obviously, again, it's probably still going to be matchup dependent. Um, but again, like it just kind of depends. But for me, I think it's probably more realistic that it's another first round exit because
Yeah.
I think I don't like the combination of Towns and Gobert personally. I don't think that's going to be good enough to win you much more than a round. And
Sure.
I think it's got to be a very specific team that you got to be playing against for that to happen.
And a team
Um,
with Gobert has its limitations. I think that's another thing. Like I think you need a very strong offensive core. If you're gonna have Gobert out on the court, because I don't know, I just feel like you need your one, your two, and your three, and probably even your four to be stellar offensive players. And I
yeah,
don't think Minnesota has that. I don't think that formula is just gonna work. You know?
yeah, because you have Edwards, obviously, who can score. Towns
Yes.
can score.
Yes.
Conley isn't really a scorer at this point, but
No.
he's capable of having
If he's
games where
open, he'll shoot.
yeah. Same with McDaniel's, right? He's not necessarily a scorer, but he's capable of, like you said, knocking down some shots. So that's kind
Right.
of how you look at it. But then that's also why you have a Nas Reed as well. I mean, they're paying, like you mentioned, a ton of money. for three centers, right? But they're all really centers, right? None of
Yeah.
them are. I mean, like I guess you could maybe at times have Reed as like a four.
But he's really a true center,
Yeah,
though. He's just
yeah,
a
because
little shorter than the other
yeah,
guys.
because he's undersized, but he's also really big.
Right.
So like he's not like a normal four, right?
Right.
He's really more, like you said, it's sort of like just an undersized center.
Yeah, that's all he is to me.
Yeah, because and again, like each one, it's kind of nice to have them do a little bit of different things, right? Because like Towns is your main offensive scorer guy,
Hmm.
right? But as a defender, doesn't really give you that much,
Right?
right? Gobert is pretty good defensively, but obviously offensively he's very limited. And I think that's really with Gobert the biggest problem is it's
Yes.
not like because I know people will mention like, well, he gets cooked, by guards. Most centers get cooked by guards
Yeah, that happens.
in the NBA because that's just what happens when you're 7 feet and you're not super quick. It's very hard to stay in front of guards. There's only a handful of bigs that can really do that. It's really the offense because it's like he doesn't really have any like real consistent go-to moves around the
Right.
basket. Right, he's not really much of a floor spacer shooter. I mean, I think he made one in the World Cup.
Yeah.
Where he made the funny comment about what it felt like to make his first three.
Yeah.
But is he going to do that in regular NBA games? I don't know. So that's kind of the issue I think is more so his offense. Like, and again, that goes back to what you're saying with like you need a strong offensive core around him, right? Because like in Utah, you had a decent offensive
Right.
group, I think, right, for the
Yes.
most part. But
Donovan Mitchell.
yeah, but the problem was the defense, right? Because
Right.
Conley wasn't great defensively. Mitchell in Utah wasn't great defensively. Bogdanovich wasn't great defensively. Um, right? Like it was mainly what, like Ingles was like probably one of your best defenders,
And
right?
that's not the best, guy that you want to have out there.
Yeah,
I don't know. It's tough.
right. Whereas like here you have, I think collectively better defensive personnel.
Absolutely.
Um, but we'll see. But like I said, I think the main issue for me is that like I think they will like. Can they have a better record? Yeah, I think they will probably have a better record,
Hmm.
but will they do better playoff? Because
Right.
again, when you give up picks like that, like you got we like it's got to lead to some type of playoff success, and it can't just be first round exits every year. Because then otherwise, what was the point of the trade, right?
Right.
Like if you didn't really get any further than before, then there was no point, right? It'd be one thing if they got to the second round or the conference finals, then we could say, okay, that was more of a success, right? Because I
Sure.
don't need Minnesota to win a title.
No,
You
we just need to see them
know,
go farther than that.
yeah, yeah, I
It's
don't
not
need
as
them to win.
advertised.
Yeah, I don't need them to win a title this season.
No. No, no, no,
But
no.
can we see more success this season? Can we see them go past the first round?
I
Right?
need
Can
to
we
see
see
them have a
them not?
better record too.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think that will go a long way into determining that. It's just again the issue for me is that I do think they could have a better record, but a similar outcome where they just get bounced in the first round.
Exactly.
Just because again, like we talked about, yeah, Minnesota did make some improvements, but other teams improved as well. Um, and some I think to a higher degree, and some of them were already better. So it's like, the teams that were already better than them that improved. I don't think Minnesota did enough to jump over those teams.
No.
But I think if you have better luck in terms of your health and Edwards takes a step forward, that should get you closer to like 45, wins or something like that, right? Like, that should get you closer to that. And if again, like, in this year's postseason, right, three more wins, that would have been, a higher seed, like because I mean, I think the Lakers were the seventh seed, and I think
They
they
were at
won what,
43.
yeah, 43 games, yeah. So
Yeah.
that they won one more game than Minnesota,
Yep.
and that got them the seventh seed. Um, and then I think Golden State, right, won 44 games,
Yep.
right? So, like I said, 45 games, that would have put you,
Where
at the,
Phoenix was
yeah,
at the
yeah, that
four
would have put
slot.
yeah, I think, yeah, that would have put you like in the 5, 6 seed spot. So, again, like I think if they have better luck injury wise, right? Because again, Towns up until the last couple of seasons have been pretty durable. Now, maybe just because, and it's not like he's old, right?
No.
It's just, he's, he's not like 21 anymore. But again, he's not old, right?
Right.
He's like 28, I
Yeah.
think. So I mean, like he's not old. He
He's been
should be.
around though.
Yeah, he should be entering his prime. Um, like I said, I mean, again, last season, right? What did he put up? Like 21 a game. Half a block, 8 rebounds. The 3-point percentage took a dip, so that was
Yes.
kind of intriguing. He took more attempts, but again, you expect some of the offensive numbers to go down just because now Edwards is going to be taking more shots.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, like he didn't have that, a couple seasons ago. But now, like, Edwards, you think, like we said, we think he should be the guy that you should build around going forward. So, there is a world, not this season, I don't think, but there is a world where at some point, if it continues to not work very well, then they may kind of almost be like forced into trading Karl Anthony Towns. It's just the issue for him is he's on a huge contract. So it's like at that point, how many teams are really, really intrigued in terms of, wanting him? It's like with Gobert, where he's got a big contract as well,
Hmm.
for a few years. And, it's not going to be obviously we've seen, right? Anybody can be traded, right? We were skeptical about the Westbrook contract being moved. We thought it was possible, but I think both of us weren't quite sure that they were going to necessarily trade him.
Right.
So obviously if that can be moved at some point, the other ones can be moved. It's just those have more years left. Um, so that's the issue. I think at some point you may be forced into moving Towns because I just think with his contract, I just think it's kind of hard to make this team much better.
Yeah.
And you're kind of banking on Edwards being a superstar. And even if he becomes a superstar, I don't know if the team as currently constructed would still be enough, to make consistently deep playoff runs.
And the only person on this team that has the potential, I think, to take that leap to put them in, contending spots is Anthony Edwards. Towns is
Right.
not going to take another leap. Gobert is definitely not going to take another leap.
He's probably
Conley's
going
on the Yeah, exactly. And a lot of these guys are on the decline, and then some of them are more so role players, which aren't going to be superstars. So, you're absolutely right to the point where, their cap is really like limiting them because they can't really do anything as long as
to.
either Towns or Gobert is on this roster.
Right. Yeah. Because that. Yeah. And and again, eventually, right next season, right, Edwards is gonna, his contract is gonna kick in, and that's kind of also something, that is kind of difficult, right? Because a lot of times, ideally, you'd like to find, and put together some good teams before you start paying your best player a ton of money, right? Because it's
Right.
just easier, right? Like, with Dallas, right? It's easier, to put together a really good team when Luka Doncic is making like, 10, 12 million a year. But now that he's on that huge contract, right, that becomes much harder. You just have more limitations. Not that you can't do it, right? But
Right.
obviously you're in a really good position if you can put together a good team. Like, with Golden State, right? They had a relatively inexpensive roster. Part of that was they didn't have, they ended up not paying Curry a whole lot initially because of the injuries. But, still they ended up having the cap, to continue to build, right? And then the cap spiked, so they got Durant. So they got a little bit lucky, but still, right? Like, regardless, they weren't paying their guys a ton of money relative to other really good teams.
Sure.
Uh, whereas now, like, right, Gobert's their highest paid player at 41 million. Towns is
Which is
making
crazy.
36. I mean, obviously Edwards is not going to be their highest paid player yet because he's on the rookie scale contract.
Yes.
But still, right, like, just that's a lot of money for two guys who play the same position. That's basically 80 million. And then Nas Reed, right? You look at his contract, he's at about 13 million. So I mean, you're basically talking about 90 million is spent on three guys who all basically play the same position.
Right.
And
How are they going to share minutes? Stuff like
yeah,
that. It's going to be
and
very
yeah,
interesting.
exactly. And realistically, ideally, they're not sharing the floor together because
No,
they're
not
all
all three.
centers.
Nope.
Yeah, they're all centers, and none of them really, to me, like you would necessarily want to have at the four.
No.
Like I said, maybe Nas Reed just because he's a little undersized, but still, right? Like to me, that personally, I think they're all like kind of just like pure fives.
Right.
So
I agree.
yeah, so that's kind of the issue there. So like you said, and like I said as well, I think at a certain point, you're probably just gonna have to move off of one of those guys. But I don't think that's gonna happen this season.
No.
Um,
It'll be in the future, though.
yeah, exactly. And then Mike Conley, right? He's on, I think the last year of his deal. What does that look like, right? Because again, are they gonna re-sign him next offseason and bring him back? Are they gonna trade him at the deadline, maybe for something else? So they have some potential flexibility there.
Because what?
You
He's
know,
going to be making 24 this year, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's just he's in the last year of his deal.
Sure.
So, obviously you have to make a decision on whether or not, after that you bring him back, right? Because again, and like I said, given his age, you don't want to pay him that much per year.
Mm-mm.
At this point, maybe you want to keep him around, but I don't know. So that's the issue with Minnesota where it's like I have no idea, what they're going to do with this team. But I think as of right now, they're probably just going to, just be like, let's just see what happens while we're healthy. Maybe we'll, win a decent amount of games. If we're really good, maybe at the deadline, maybe we'll do something. But I don't see a scenario where they're like a title team this year.
Right. I agree.
I think it's more so likely they might be better this season record wise, but then probably result wise be the same, right? Where
I
like
agree.
they probably just go out in the first round. Second round, I think, but I think you'd have to be pretty fortunate. Either like, you got to get really good luck injury wise, or I think you'd have to have a really favorable matchup.
Yeah. That's the best way to look at it. I don't know. They're in a quagmire, I think, with the big spot, but outside of the big spot, I think they're pretty much, set for a while. I do, like them extending Anthony Edwards, and then obviously their draft pick was pretty good. I think we're both very high
Yeah,
on Leonard Miller as well. So
yeah,
I'm not
and
too concerned with anything but really that center position and how
yeah,
the rotation is going to work.
and keep in mind, it'll get even more expensive, right? Because eventually they'll have to extend Jaden McDaniels, right?
Yep.
Like they'll have to do that, at some point, assuming they want to keep him, which I would assume they do.
Oh
So,
yeah, they definitely do.
yeah, so like it'll get even more expensive down the line. And, like I don't think the ceiling of the team as currently constructed is good enough to win a title. And
Yeah.
again, it doesn't have to be right now.
No,
It's just, ideally you have Edwards and we know he's going to continue to be really good. So,
don't want to waste his years though.
yeah. Right now I think the goal should be you got to build around him and how can you maximize what he can do? I
Yep.
think that's kind of how you have to look at it. I think at this point we're kind of done trying to maximize Towns. Cuz like I said I think he's entering his prime and at this point probably just is what he is where
Right.
I think he's a good player, but I don't think he's good enough to be the best player on a really good team.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, and
And
it's kind
it's similar like Anthony Edwards kind of reminds me of like young D Wade. He's very explosive, stuff like that. But like, I just don't know how they're gonna build a roster, you know, in the near future. Like they couldn't do it this offseason. We knew that. I think in the next coming off seasons, we're definitely gonna be seeing them make some moves.
yeah.
Because I think that Anthony Edwards is probably going to win a title at some point. I just don't know if it's going to be in Minnesota or not.
Yeah. I think ideally you'd like to have like, like a 3 and D-ish type point guard since he has the
Right,
ball a lot. Like a center that's pretty good defensively that can, set screens for him. And then after that, like, McDaniels is perfectly fine. And then like another four that's like a two-way stretch big. But again,
right.
like, these are all in theory.
It's
You know,
hypotheticals. It's hard
yeah,
to
it's all
deal with that.
yeah, it's hard to deal with that. And it's hard to deal with that right now because again, like, he's where he is right now, ideally isn't where he's gonna be in the future because it
Exactly.
will be even better.
Right.
So it's just a matter of right now. I think you just kind of have to kind of like, just eat some of the mistakes that you've made
Yeah.
if you're Minnesota and just kind of, find ways to not make it quite as bad. Because there's a world where you make it, where you try to overcorrect and then you potentially make it even worse.
Right. So
So
they
it's
might
like
just have
that.
to ride this out. I think that's what they're gonna do.
Yeah, so because that's the tough part. Like I said, I never liked the trade in the first place. I understood, like what people said when they were trying to, say that it was good. I just never understood it because I just never looked at Towns as like somebody that can guard multiple positions.
Right.
Um, and again, like I don't think you should make a move that should optimize Towns. I think you should be making moves that optimize Edwards.
Yes.
But again, a lot of that's hindsight at this point. You know what I mean? So
Right.
like sometimes people make mistakes, and I think this was a bad one.
Yeah,
And
and they
it's
just
just
have to
kind of
live
wild,
with it.
right? And it's wild because this is the guy, that helped put together that Denver roster, right? A lot of the guys that were on Denver that just won the title, he helped get those guys there, right? He
Right.
drafted Jokic, he drafted Jamal Murray. I'm pretty sure he was there, when they got Aaron Gordon, right? He drafted Michael Porter Jr. So I mean, a lot of the guys on that roster, he was there for, the main core. He
Because he's only
basically
been gone for like what, 2 years now?
last,
Maybe one?
yeah,
Yeah.
last season was his first year, right?
Right.
Yeah, like
He was there for everything. He
yeah,
constructed that. And it's
yeah,
crazy that he had to watch them win the finals, but
yeah. But I don't know. Like I said, I almost kind of wonder, like when you look at what was given up for Mitchell compared to what was given up for Gobert, you almost
mhm.
kind of wonder like whether or not like maybe some executives, maybe might like have like feel more high on Gobert than Mitchell. I do just kind of wonder,
Hmm.
just because
Never
when
really
you just
thought of that.
yeah, just like because like I just was thinking about it because both guys were on Utah, they were both
Sure.
moved,
Sure.
for certain packages, because and we can look at it right, like I mean, what was the Utah trade, right? It was Laurie Markkinen, Ochai Agbaji, Colin Sexton, 3 first-round picks and 2 pick swaps, um, but at the time Markkinen wasn't valued as highly,
No.
um,
They didn't
you know,
expect him to take the leap that he did.
yeah, Agbaji was just drafted. I guess Colin Sexton people liked, but even at that point, like I think people weren't quite as high on him as they were when he first came in.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
and then 3 first-round picks, and then two
Hmm.
pick swaps, right? Compared to the Gobert trade where it was 4 first-round picks, 1 pick swap, Walker Kessler, and then a bunch of vets, right? So I mean,
Okay.
I guess kind of similar, but I don't feel like they're similar impact players. You know what I
Okay.
mean?
Yeah, I
Like
get you because I feel like, and also like Cleveland, they had a better regular season, I think, than Minnesota, in my opinion, but equally bad postseasons. So
yeah.
it's like, I think they're
It's almost
probably on the
like a
same
wash.
level. Would you say now?
You almost wonder if it's kind of a wash, like, but I think people feel more optimistic about Cleveland.
Yeah, they have more promise.
Yeah, but it is kind of interesting because then it's like when you look at Minnesota, right? Like, other than Mitchell, you don't really. I don't know if people feel like Garland or Mobley have like Edwards type potential. I think people think that they'll be really good, but I think people feel like Edwards could be a superstar. I don't think people feel like Garland or Mobley will be a superstar. I
Yeah,
think people are very high. I'm like Mobley a lot,
me
but
too.
like
And I love Garland. Like, I'm very high on him,
right,
but I don't think Garland will be touching what Anthony Edwards will potentially be hitting, once he's way up there. I
yeah.
just don't think so. But Garland is going to be good, but I don't know. It's interesting. You're right. That's a really good, like, way to look at it. I never really thought about it. I kind of just, like, I guess, brushed the Donovan Mitchell thing to the side and then was just thinking about the Gobert just because of how horrid it went. But it's gone equally as bad so far, I think.
So I guess, yeah. So I guess we'll kind of see, how that continues to go. But like I said, for Minnesota, to kind of just put a bow on it, like I said, I think ceiling wise, probably not much more than a first round trip.
Hmm.
Like I said, unless they get a little bit lucky. I know it sounds like I've said that about some of these other teams, but
Right.
some of it is just kind of what tiers are these teams in, right? Like I think
Absolutely.
Minnesota is probably like in that third tier, maybe, like or third or fourth, whatever you want to say,
Hmm.
where it's like you have Denver, which you can either have Denver in its own tier or Denver in a tier with the other guy, other teams like
Hmm.
LA or Phoenix or Golden
Sure.
State or whatever. Then I think the Clippers are probably below that,
Yes.
right? The top tier, right? But they're still in that other tier, that's above like Minnesota.
Right.
Um, I guess, like I don't know. I feel like Minnesota is probably in that tier where it's like, you know, are they better than Dallas? Like,
Can be. They
they
can be.
like they don't have Luca, but like
Right.
collectively in terms of their roster, right? Do you like their roster better than Dallas's roster?
Collectively, yes.
Yeah,
I
so
think I
that's
do. But the fact that Dallas has Luca, I think puts them a little bit higher than Minnesota
yeah,
because Towns is not better than Luca. Gobert is
yeah,
definitely not better than Luca. Anthony
right.
Edwards can get to Luca's level, but we just have to wait and see. It's more of a waiting game with this
Not there
team.
yet. He's
Right.
not there. Yeah,
Exactly.
so that's kind of how we have to. Yeah, because that's the thing. Because it's like because Dallas has a bona fide superstar, it's possible they could just, like 2 seasons ago, right? They made the Western Conference Finals, which I think was unexpected,
Right.
although that was a, relatively weaker Western Conference.
Absolutely.
Whereas now it's a much stronger Western Conference. But, I think that's the main thing with Minnesota is, Edwards is going to have to be a superstar for them to get past the first round, I think. I think that's kind of, sort of like, an easy way to sum it up, right? If
I agree.
Edwards reaches, that superstar status, or like I said, if he encroaches that top 2015 spot, then I think I would feel more comfortable about them getting past the first round because then I could say, oh, this is a matchup where Edwards can be the best player on the floor,
Sure.
right? But if he's, about the same as last year, right? I'm not saying that's going to happen, but like
Right.
if he's about the same as last year, then they're probably just going to go out in the first round. Because again,
Yeah.
I don't expect anyone else, to get much better than what they are right now, other than maybe McDaniel's, just because he's young as well.
Yeah, but even then, is that even gonna, give you the edge in a first round matchup? I don't know. And it's like
Yeah,
for me, I think this team is probably going to finish around like the seventh seed. I think they're going to be better than eighth, but I think that seventh seed is probably where they're locked for. I'm assuming somebody's going to miss some time. Um, and then, like you said, it's really all contingent on if Anthony Edwards makes that leap for them to even get past the first round. So I think their ceiling as of right now, not looking into the future or any hypotheticals, is probably first round exit.
yeah, exactly. So I guess, after all that, what grade are we going to give Minnesota? Because I think we were somewhat at times positive, but then other
Yeah,
times kind of negative.
sure.
So, what do you kind of give for this one?
I'm probably gonna go with a C on this one. It's kind of hard to judge this one because they did draft Leonard Miller, great pickup, and then obviously re-signing Nas Reed to a contract extension, re-signing Anthony Edwards. It's just there's a lot of money in that center pool, and I don't necessarily like that. I'm not comfortable with that. That's a lot of money for one position, for three guys. I think you need to divvy it up and move on from somebody. But that wasn't realistic for this offseason. But they did re-sign and bring back a bunch of guys. And like I said, Leonard Miller, great draft pick. So I'm kind of it's all averaging out. So I think it's probably going to be around the C range.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of like with you, like a C, maybe a C plus. Because like I said,
Yeah.
I like some of the guys that they brought in. Like you mentioned, with the guys that they drafted.
Hmm.
Along with a couple of the guys like you mentioned, Shake Milton or Troy Brown or
Yes.
whomever. But still, it's none of them are like, you know, crazy. Like, oh, this feels like a great, awesome,
Right.
amazing signing. You know what I mean? And again, that's tough to do. Like because we mentioned that with some of the other teams. Sometimes with some of these teams because of the cap situation, it's
It's
tough
hard.
to do. So you're also just like we mentioned, banking on the young guys. Do they continue to develop? Um, but I still feel like again, ideally, I would have liked to, maybe seen them, move one of these guys. But I didn't think that was going to
It,
happen
it
anyway.
wasn't gonna happen this
Yeah,
season. We know it's gonna happen. It just wasn't gonna happen this one.
yeah.
So
So that's kind of the thing that I'm looking at. So like I said, I'm kind of with you where it's like I guess like maybe I'll be a little bit nicer and give them a C plus just because
okay,
like I don't like their off season was bad. But I don't feel like it was like a you know a great off season. Like I just think it was fine. Like
sure.
like
It was
because again,
mid.
yeah, given what they could have done, it's fine because it could have been worse, right? Where like they lost Nas Reed, to somebody, right? Or traded one of those guys for like some horrible package or
Right.
something like that. So there's a world where it could have been worse. But I also think there's a way for it to have been better. But again, like you said, I don't think that they were really going to trade either of those guys. Um, so like I said, I'd say probably C plus, right? Because
Okay,
for
that's
like I
fair.
said, for it to have been like a B or better, one of those guys would have needed to have been moved. But
That's fair.
yeah, because I just feel like again, I knew they weren't going to do a whole lot, so I think it was fine, right? Like
Right.
I wouldn't say like I loved what they did, but it was fine, right? Like it could have been worse, could have been better, but it wasn't bad.
And they didn't lose anything crazy either.
Yeah,
So
exactly, right? Yeah, because if they had lost Nas Reed, it would have been like an easy D, right?
exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, D or borderline F.
Right.
But because you brought back Nas Reed on a good contract, because again, for what he is, right, like 13 million a year, that's fine, right?
Right.
Because he's good enough that on some teams he could start.
Oh yeah, you could start on a multiple teams.
Exactly. Yeah, he's good enough that he could be a starting center on a decent number of teams. Right? Because he's certainly an above average center. Um, it's just like you said, a lot of money for three guys that all play the same position that realistically can't really play together a whole lot.
Yeah.
Um, that's a lot, but again, like it was fine. I
Right.
think it's mainly the Nas Reed thing. I think that's that's like allowing me to give them a C
It's
plus.
averaging them out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because like I said, draft it was fine, but I don't expect those guys to play a whole lot.
Mm-mm.
Free agency, fine, I guess. But
So
it's really
so. They just
yeah.
were able to
Again,
take what they had.
it was really the Nas Reed re-signing. Where I'm like, okay, that's fine.
And the
Like,
Ant Edwards extension, I
and
think, is good as well.
exactly, and I mean, he was gonna get a max extension anyways.
Yeah. But the
Um,
fact that they did it, we
yeah,
we
it was
we knew it
surprising.
was coming.
Yeah, it was a little surprising that it wasn't like immediately when
Right.
I think the first two was Halliburton and Desmond Bain,
Yes.
but still, like you said, you got it done.
Mm-hmm.
So now nobody's worried. I don't think anybody was worried
No,
anyways.
no,
But
no,
either
no.
way, like you said, like you got it done, so that's good.
Yeah.
Um, but it's really the Nas Reed thing where I'm like, yeah, that's fine.
Right.
Like other than that, like you said, Shake Milton and Troy Brown Jr. are okay. Um, and I think there's gonna be regular season games where they help them just because you know, Shake Milton's a decent shooter, and then Troy Brown Jr. gives you a little bit more like versatility at the 2-3 spot, but
Mm-hmm.
still, like, I think it's more so like Edwards and McDaniels, how much better do they get, especially Edwards? Because like you said with McDaniels, he's more of like I don't want to say like he role player because that almost suggests like he's like just because I think he's better than that, but he's also probably not like a star player. You know what I mean?
Right.
He's a good player. He's a good player. But I don't think you expect him to be like a great player. Edwards, I think you expect to be a great player.
Yeah. I agree. I think Jaden
Yeah,
McDaniels is more like a rotational guy, but when he's on the court, he provides so much, whether it be defensively,
yeah,
just getting out there and just hustling. Like there's more to it than just, scoring and stuff.
yeah.
So
Because that's the thing. I think when we say role players, sometimes people kind of almost feel like that it's sort of a
that's
slight.
degrading, right?
Yeah,
But
because
no,
like
he's more of a solid rotational guy. I
Yeah,
think that's the best way
he's
to
a good
describe
player.
it. Yes, he's a great player, actually.
He's not a star, but he's a guy that could pretty much start for any team,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So he's better. Like I said, he's better than a role player, but not a star.
Right.
He's a very good player.
Right.
So, yeah. So I mean, with that, let us know what you think, in terms of our take about Minnesota in the comments. Again, I feel like this is somewhat of a polarizing one because I do think like there are people who think Minnesota had a really good offseason, and I think others thought you know, like that kind of just continued to clown them for the Gobert trade.
Right.
We just thought it was okay,
Yeah.
right?
We're not
So,
gonna sit here and pile on. The Gobert thing is what it is, but at the same time, they worked with what they had and they did okay.
I do think, yeah, there's worse situations you could
Oh
be
yeah.
in, but but with that, now moving on to the news rumors, not really a whole lot at this point, right? I think, reportedly the NBA is going to do, like another investigation into the Philly situation. Obviously we've been talking about that, with, the scenario of Harden
Hmm.
potentially not showing up to camp, being frustrated with Daryl Morey, who used to be, I guess, his, one of his closest pals in
Yeah.
the
Right hand
NBA.
man.
Yeah, I guess that's not the case anymore, but
Nope.
I guess in Harden's case, left-hand man, but
Yeah.
still.
Yeah. You're right.
Yeah, but it is kind of interesting, because again, they had an investigation for them last season, right? Because of what happened, where Harden took less money, in order to get them to sign certain guys, right? And that happened very quickly. So yeah, I think that was kind of like, where people were like, that's where like we need to look into the tampering stuff, and then they took
Hmm.
away their second. But I guess now they're gonna look deeper into it and kind of see like, was that promised, and then what happened? I don't know.
Right.
I don't know if a whole lot will come out of this, but it's clear that a lot of guys are in the wrong in this situation. Because again, I think Morey's made some mistakes. I think Harden's made some mistakes. Um, I think we talked about we do have some sympathy for Harden if that's what he was promised.
Hmm.
But at the same time, it's also at times hard to have a lot of sympathy for him just because of the situations he's put himself in these
Right.
last few seasons. Where he's wanted out of a situation, got his way, and then still wasn't thrilled with
Right.
the stuff that happened. Especially with some of the poor playoff performances when his team really needed him. Um, so that's kind of where it's kind of hard to go all the way in on Harden with that. Um, and then even with Daryl Morey, I do think at times he's been a pretty good GM, but I think sometimes he's put himself in tough positions when you look at the fact where it's like he's kind of been really quick to deal guys for certain whatevers, right? And I think he may have burned some bridges
Absolutely.
with some players and stars and teams, and
And
that
executives for sure.
yeah, and other executives as well potentially. Um, and now it seems like he's burned bridges with Harden, and that's a shame because that, like you said, that was the guy that those two guys were incredibly close, right? When Harden was in Houston, right, it was Daryl Morey, that was hyping him up, and saying like, this guy's the greatest offensive player ever. This guy should have won the MVP, whatever year that was, 2017, stuff like that. But now that relationship is done, and that's unfortunate. But at the same time, like you said, it's hard to have a ton of sympathy for everybody involved. But either way, you know, it would be nice if this situation, was kind of resolved at some point.
Hmm.
Just because, man, like we're talking about it a lot, and it feels like if everybody involved just sticks around, it's gonna get bad.
Yeah,
Just
it has
what
potential to
we,
get really ugly. And like for
yeah,
me, like, we're not insiders. We don't know, what actually happened. We're just, looking from the outside in. And it's like looking from this perspective, it looks very shady. Um, doesn't look very good for either party. And it's like if this was like some sort of handshake deal where it was word of mouth, that makes it look even worse because then it's going to turn into he said, So like if this was in writing, okay, then we can, have a conversation. And I'm hoping that this investigation gets to the point where they can find some solid evidence to, refute somebody's point and, make sure that somebody is in the right because I think there is a right and a wrong here. But we just don't know what it is at this moment. So I'm hoping that
yeah.
does get resolved, like you said, because honestly, I'm getting tired of talking about it.
Right. And then, that kind of leads into the next thing where, according to Yahoo Sports, right, like teams are monitoring the Embiid situation, especially like the Knicks and the Heat,
Hmm.
just in case, something happens where like, Harden gets moved and then Embiid is frustrated, because again, if they do trade Harden and it's not a good return, then that doesn't really help Philly, right? Because
Right.
again, if you trade Harden for peanuts, you're not any closer than you were last year, right?
Right.
Maybe, I mean, maybe you might do something, but I think it would be more likely it wouldn't be any different. You might be
Yeah.
worse. So, because I do think you need, a pretty good guard around Embiid, just because as a center, he's just not always going to be in a position where he can do certain things.
Hmm.
So it's like you have to have some type of guard who can break down the defense, and score, and create and play make at a high level. And Harden can still do that. He's not quite the same as he used to be, but he can still do that. Maybe you feel like Maxi can take a step forward, but then it's like still, you also need somebody who can defend as well. Like again, we'll get in more into Philly once
Yeah.
we get to that team, but regardless, it's just a rough situation, and I do kind of wonder ultimately, what happened, because we initially thought that Harden early on was going to be traded,
Hmm.
and then like the last week or so, right, they kind of shut that down. But now we're still hearing stuff, right? It seems like Harden now has gotten more aggressive, in terms of trying to get his way, to go out. And then if that does happen, we'll see what happens with Embiid. But still, like, again, it's just rough because we picked Boston to beat Philly. We were surprised, that Philly went up 3-2 against Boston, and they had a chance to, eliminate them and send them home, in at home,
Yep.
in Game 6 in Philly, and then they just kind of melted down, and from that point on, everything just fell apart. Again, right? Because Philly has been in that situation before, right? Where that happened to them against the Hawks, right?
Hmm.
That was kind of what ended the relationship with Simmons, right? Where the Sixers, had fourth quarter leads, right? And then somehow they blew them, and then before you know it, they got eliminated by a team that they really shouldn't have been eliminated to.
Right.
And again, it's different with Boston because we thought that Boston was better, but clearly Philly was good enough to take him out.
They just
'Cause
gave
they were
up.
up. Yeah, they just didn't play well down the stretch eventually, and then like you said in Game 7, eventually they quit. So I mean, and that's rough, for that team, and for that organization and for the city, because again,
Hmm.
like Philly is a city, that kind of prides itself on having, really good teams, especially really tough teams that play hard and don't quit. But that team just quit in the end.
Yeah, they gave up.
So,
And like for me, I don't know. I think if Harden leaves, and the return value is like a blow pop, a bag of chips and cash considerations, then, I think Philly's pretty much screwed. I think Embiid's gonna ask out like immediately, I think he's gonna be gone. I'm not sure, if they'll get that deal done, but goodness gracious, it seems like Philly is just falling apart. And
yeah,
it like you said, it started, with Boston,
right.
so.
Yeah, and it's kind of wild, because again, like if Harden just walks, right, because he's in the last year of his deal, right, then
Hmm.
you can't get anything, and I think they would be planning for cap space. I don't think anybody's going there, but either way, I
Harden
guess
might
that.
not even play.
Well, the funny thing is, funny that you say that. According to the CBA, there's a rule, and I think it was initially maybe Zach Lowe or Brian Windhorst that pointed it out. I can't remember which one, but there's a rule in the CBA where if he doesn't show up within like 30 days or something of training camp, Philly can basically prevent him from playing basketball for an entire year.
Wow, that's crazy. Okay.
Yeah,
I
like
didn't
yeah,
even know that.
I didn't know that either until maybe like a couple weeks ago, and I heard about that. And it's again, we haven't seen a situation happen,
Right.
like that, but apparently that's the rule. Where like
I hope it
if
doesn't get to that point.
yeah, if that were to happen, right, like then Philly could block him from playing anywhere. It's not even just the NBA. Like let's say you wanted to play in like China, and learn Chinese for a year or
Right.
something.
And he's very fond of those people.
They wouldn't even let him learn Chinese. So I mean, like for a whole
Yeah.
year, like they
That's
could
bad,
literally
bro.
doing that. So that's just kind of wild. But I didn't even know that was a rule. But and it is kind of funny with the CBAs, across all sports. I think sometimes there's random clauses or
Hmm.
you know rules or whatever that you don't
Sure.
really think about because we just haven't been in situations necessarily like this before. But yeah, so the official quote is any player who withholds playing services for more than 30 days after the start of the last season covered by his contract could be deemed to have violated his contract and forbidden from entering free agency and
Hmm.
signing with another professional team until the team he last played for expressly agrees otherwise.
Wow. That's
Yeah, so
that's
yeah,
very
exactly.
restrictive. But I think it is a good thing, honestly, because like, you know, people shouldn't be breaching contracts. People shouldn't just be sitting out because they're not happy. It's your job. Play basketball. Simple as that. I know you may not be happy, and I know it's tough. We can't speak from it because we're not in the NBA. But
We are,
in general, I think it is good for both sides to have some sort of leverage.
yeah. Yeah, because again, at the end of the day, everybody is trying to get what they want. So we're
Right.
gonna see, like who blinks first, and it'll
I'm
be
very
interesting.
curious. I'm
we've been
hoping this thing gets nixed by the NBA and they just come in with like a hammer and just resolve this thing.
Yeah, we'll because again we'll see because I think Silver has kind of built up a reputation as being like a little bit more player friendly.
Absolutely. Then
Kind of
Stern? Oh yeah.
yeah, exactly. Where he's kind of like okay with like letting the players kind of do what they want, but then
Sure.
at times like it does feel like you kind of need to probably like you
Put
said
your
lay
foot
there
down.
sometimes and just because again like situations like this I just think are not a good look.
Right. It's
Um,
not good for the NBA because it's bad publicity, you know? It's the same thing with the off the court stuff with, other players. Like, it's just not good. It's so dramatic, and we just need to be focused back on basketball.
yeah. Well, yeah, all right. Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, we appreciate the support for the last episode featuring, our interview with KJ McDaniels, right? So if you haven't already seen that, check it out. It was really interesting. And I think he gave a lot of insight, like you
Yes.
mentioned, into, what it meant to, what it's like as a professional basketball player, because he's been around. So check that out if you haven't already. Let us know what you think about our take on Minnesota in the comments, or otherwise. As always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for listening. We appreciate the support, and we'll see you Friday.